will begin today's program with some conversation, but I've saved time at the end really to dig in and dive into the questions that you have and to have some more interactive conversation. So please remember to put your questions in the Q&A. I also want to say that I know Katrina, Dr. Caldwell is maybe having a little technical difficulty. I had a little trouble with Zoom, so while we're doing this, she may need to shut her video down and shift. So I want you to be aware of that before we get started. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the program over to Anika Penn, as I said, SAIS 2010. She is our current first Vice President of the Alumni Council, and in October, after our meeting, is our incoming and will be our President of the Alumni Council. So thank you so much. And thank you, Anika. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Elena. I am super excited to be here this afternoon. So thank you for inviting me to speak with our esteemed new colleague, Katrina Caldwell. And without any sort of further discussion, I know that we all received Katrina's really impressive bio. So I just want to kind of dive right in, and rather than reading through that, I wonder if you could just take us through your origin story, really, with the question being, why are you called to do this work?
Wow. Thank you, Anika, and thank you to Alumni Affairs for the opportunity, Elena for getting us ready, those of you who have called in, the staff support, getting us through the technology. And I hope that I can stay on with our Zoom audience today. And I look forward to meeting many of you in person, including Anika. We've had lots of great interactions online. And so I think when we meet in person, it'll be even more of a great opportunity.
Like old friends.
That's right, absolutely. So I'll go ahead and get started. To your point, we don't have a lot of time. I'll say that the word calling is an interesting one. I was actually just talking to a friend of mine over the weekend about that concept of calling, and she's actually been called to the ministry, and we talked about that work and what that means for her, and many of the implications of that work in this moment, and the opportunities for her to engage in a different way because of that calling. I think we think about it in that way. But I also just think about it and to be honest, there have been many times over my career where I have thought about how do I get out of diversity, equity, inclusion work, because that work can have both professional and personal implications for folks who are doing this work, who've been doing it for a long time. But there's also beauty in this work, and that work is fulfilling every time you see someone make a transition. Every time you see someone who has access, who gains access, who didn't have access, every time you see a barrier torn down, every time you see individuals who are moving and advocating on their own, that folks move out of resilience into agency and opportunity. So that is the beauty of the work that keeps me engaged. But the origin story is I started in the 1990s, early 90s. Working in a program called TRIO, that many folks may be aware of the TRIO program. And my degree is in English literature, and so I was teaching an English composition course to students who were in a program called Bridge. And it was a summer bridge program for them from Chicago Public High Schools to the University of Illinois, Chicago. And I remember at the very beginning of each of my courses, I do what is called an onboarding or an orientation, because I believe that students need to understand how to navigate our structures in order to be successful. So I start off explaining the course, but getting to know the students. And in that first class, it felt like this is your life. I mean, those students were telling stories that were my story, that having guidance counselors who didn't believe we had the capacity, trying to overcome the folks who had low expectations for us. Many of them who had, like I had, a mother who taught me the importance of having a career in college and education and striving for excellence. But also some of the difficult parts about their journey, in that they had folks who didn't believe in them, and folks were close to thinking college was attainable. And hearing those stories, I was on the path to being a college professor. I knew I wanted to be a professor in English. But after I heard those stories, I thought of the people who were on my path, like the Minnie Cooks of the world, who was a teacher who wrote my college application for me. And for all you lawyers out there, it's no longer like we're past the threat of her being held responsible for that. But you know, there were people who did that, who filled out my financial aid applications, right? Who paid our application fees to go to college. And I realized that summer, that moment, I wanted to be one of the many people out there who were making a way. And it just so happened, I figured out I could make a career out of it. So.
Oh, wow. That's a great story. And it's funny how the desire to help and to be that person that makes a difference in the lives of, you know, whether it's just one person or many people over career, can take you in so many different directions. So I wonder, you started your career at UIC, and you've worked at several different institutions. You know, why did you decide to come to Johns Hopkins?
That's a great question. And it's actually a couple of months before I got the call to apply for the position. I was sitting in a board meeting with a number of D&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals. And we were reporting out on our state's retention, recruitment rates, our enrollment rates, our success rates, and our success factors. And we were just talking about what our benchmarks were, what our best practices were. And in a moment, we were just sitting there about 2 hours having this session where we share out, and we were planning for what our next steps were for this organization. And I got this feeling of deja vu. It's like, I feel like I've been here before. I feel like I've been having this conversation for almost 27, at that point, 28 years. And I just realized it was just this moment enough. I cannot have this conversation. We all began our conversation with who are our peers. We all began our conversations with what are the benchmarks we're trying to meet. We all began our conversations with, you know, how are we going to make this incremental step forward, or based on other folks whose margins are not far from the bottom, how are we going to compare ourselves to them? And I just realized we have to do this work differently. And there are numbers of folks who had that epiphany. I'm not new in that, but it was that moment in my career that I had it. And I thought, I want to be in part of working in conversations, situations, institutions where folks are thinking about this work in a different way. And then got the call, and then all the events that happened over the fall and the summer just sort of felt like it was the right time for me to make that transition.
That's funny that you were talking about the difference in how different institutions think about this work, and that, you know, there may be this small cadre or large of folks who really want to think about this in a different way. I wonder then, as you begin your path at JHU, you know, what are the key similarities and differences between where you are now, this institution, and the previous ones where you've worked?
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about this in our kind of lead up to this conversation, right? That, you know, like for me, I definitely can talk about the institutions, but I think the questions are also different for me, right? So we often began with, you know, where are we in X? Like, where are we in the recruitment of X? And I'm more curious now to ask questions like, what would it look like if there were no barriers to success in higher education? Like, for me, that's a more compelling conversation to have, right? What does it look like we talk about how do we dismantle systems? What does it look like for structural X to go away? How will we know that an institution no longer has structural racism, sexism, heterosexism, transphobia, right? How do we know when an institution has reached that? And so those to me are more compelling questions. But to address the specific question, I've been at 4 institutions of higher education prior. coming to Hopkins, you already talked about UIC, which many of you know is a Research One public institution in Chicago. I was at DePaul, which is a large private Catholic-centered institution. Urban environments in Chicago as well. I was at Northern Illinois, and that is a regional land grant institution in the northern suburbs of Chicago. And then most recently at the University of Mississippi, which is a Research One public flagship institution. And now at Hopkins. And one of the, I think, striking similarities at all of those institutions is understanding our relationship to the communities that are both around us, right, in us, through us, right, because many of these institutions were created in communities that were there, that existed before we were created. And so trying to understand what our relationships are, what our obligations are, how our contexts in terms of reconciling our histories and understanding what we need to do as institutions to be good neighbors, good partners in that space. In all of the institutions I've been in, that's been a compelling interest for a variety of reasons. Is one similarity. And I would just say, you know, there are lots of others, but the other one I think that is striking to me is that everyone is grappling with these questions and these issues. And depending on where diversity, equity, and inclusion work is situated at a campus, it looks differently than what it is, but it doesn't change that everyone's trying to understand how we now operate with what's happening in the larger context of the world that we live in. Right? I mean, 20 years ago, you know, 25 years ago, I could do diversity, equity, inclusion work and only think about local problems or issues or opportunities. I didn't have to speak on what's happening nationally or, you know, globally. That's changed, that's shifted significantly over time.
Yeah, I think that I really like the idea of starting from the solution, starting from, you know, what does it look like to be an institution that is free from X, whatever problem X is. But I think that one of the compelling aspects of that question is that, you know, what does it mean to be an institution free from X might have a slightly different answer than what does it mean to be a city that is free from X, or a region that is free from X, or and I think that within those different answers, obviously the Venn diagram of that has a lot of overlap, but those differences, I think, come up when you have competing stakeholders, right? When you have you're an institution, but you're an institution within a city, like Hopkins, and there are different power structures at work there. Can you talk a little bit about that? I think that you've experienced that obviously in Chicago and other areas. You know, how do you address that? What have you really learned from managing different stakeholders?
I mean, that's a great question. And I think my orientation might seem odd for someone who spent their career in higher education, but I start with the fact that I don't know anything. I know nothing, right? I mean, that's a better way of saying that. I have to make the assumption I'm not the expert, right? That's a bias, but I think that I often watch folks go into a space with wanting to be quick to share their expertise and to present themselves as an expert. But in some spaces, I'm not the expert. Lived experience is, right? Understanding the ecosystem of a place, understanding where connection and disruption has happened in a place, understanding the stories of the folks who live in those spaces when other folks come and go. Being aware that, you know, in building a relationship that is mutually beneficial to both partners, that sometimes means if you have to count wins and losses, that sometimes it means you'll lose, right? Understanding power and privilege and how it operates in spaces, and trying to get what We talk about trying to be very small when you have power. Like the more power you have, the smaller footprint you want to try to have in a space. That means you want to take up less space. You want to take up less air in the room, that type of thing. So when we think about, that concept of getting proximate with folks, it means being vulnerable in ways that I was never trained naturally to be in a space, right? I was trained as an academic right? In order for me to show that I'm a strong academic and my intelligence is that I need to put it on display when I am in spaces, in relationships. And I've learned in humble ways. I remember probably my first community engagement research opportunity was when I was at Spelman, and that we were told to go into the neighboring communities and talk to folks about their dietary habits. And I had my little clipboard, right? I had my little clipboard. I had my little, my frameworks, my methodologies. Right? I knew, the language. I had studied the lingo, had practiced and been trained. And the first household that I came to, and the woman who opened that door schooled me on what it meant to do public research, right? What it meant to do community engaged research. And that was, you don't knock on someone's door at dinner time and ask them what their dietary, right? There's some rules of engagement that you need to understand,
right.
that I wasn't necessarily taught in books or in the classroom, that I had to learn in being in community and knowing that I'm still going to need to learn.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about, sort of what you're taught, that you're lucky enough to have a long and distinguished career. Much of what you're taught, particularly with respect to how to go about working on issues of diversity and equity, much of what you're taught long ago, probably, the moment shifts, and the movement towards equity shifts, and the metric shifts, and how we think about it shifts. So, the best of us can move along with it and stay, ahead of the curve. And, I'm wondering, given we're in a particular moment in Baltimore and whatever city that you're in throughout the country, and I'm wondering sort of how the current moment is shifting your thinking on your role, or whether it's you remain steadfast.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I would love for us to have some exchange around that, because we sort of talked about this as well. And it's been perplexing. Well, not perplexing. Let me change that. I found myself, when the moment started to happen, adopting the language that isn't necessarily is instinctive to me as a practitioner and a person that's lived this, this existence for how many ever years, as a person in the skin that I'm in and the experience that I'm in, this concept of a new normal. And I found myself the first 2 or 3 days in spaces where I was using that jargon. I was using that terminology. We're in a new normal. We're in a new normal. And I'm chastened as I'm often when I'm thinking about these things in a room with a student who said, "This is normal." And it just, right, it was just one of those moments.
Yeah, there's nothing new about it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, that this is just normal.
Yeah.
It's just that this is one of those moments, and that's what the beauty and power of the moment is. The unfortunate thing is on the lives of people, that people's lives had to be lost for us to have this collective attention being paid to the pain and the horror and the suffering and the lack of safety and the fear that many folks, too many folks, endure
every day.
Often.
Yeah.
That's right. And so if both these moments, and I believe that things happen for a reason, if both of these moments are about the utter shame and the pain of loss that we have experienced, and I'm never going to be grateful for advancements that we have to make on the backs of other people. Never.
Yeah.
But given the circumstances that we're in, if we don't take advantage of the loss in the advantage way that we don't honor them and move this needle forward, then shame on us.
Then yeah, there was just opportunity lost, really.
And that's, that's the moment for me. Like, that's the, lots of folks who are in D&I, D&I have been having this conversation, every time there's this shift that happens, or there's this loss, or there's this tragedy, we start up anew. There's a lot of new energy and effort. And we can't keep affording that.
Yeah. Yeah, we're at this fascinating moment where, we're in the middle of a pandemic. There's a real moment happening around the as yet unresolved issues of racial justice, and those two things are colliding at the same time. We're also in an election year, and then we're also seeing this massive demographic and generational change that I think is fueling some of the movement towards equity, or at least providing, I live in Brooklyn, and it's providing a lot of the boots on the ground for demanding better, for demanding justice. And I'm wondering, I'm sure that that's the case in Baltimore as well, though I'm not in Baltimore. I'm wondering then, given that we're in this moment and that it's happening at universities, it's happening in cities, it's happening in the countryside, what are some of your reflections on the relationship and connection between Hopkins and the city? And I understand that this is, totally not fair question.
Yeah.
You've been here a week.
Yeah.
Tell us what you think. Yeah. But I wanted to get your thoughts, because you've worked in universities that are in cities. You've worked in universities, in Tuscaloosa, the town, the town is the university, and that's a very different relationship. How do you view this within the context of the other places in which you've worked?
Right. I think that's an excellent question. And to your point, I don't know enough. I haven't actually even gotten out and about yet.
It was not fair.
Right. I think we took one, sort of a walk along Inner Harbor when we first got here, but we haven't been out and about. But to your point, or even we have driven around in neighborhoods and walked in neighborhoods and tried to get a sense. But it's just so much you can get from what you see in the houses and the churches, in the corner stores and the storefronts, right? In the parks, in the, community. There's only so much that you can see because people aren't about, right? People aren't out and about and are engaging folks. And I want to do that. I want to immerse myself. Folks have sent me titles of books that I've to read to try to understand different points of views. But again, those stories are packaged in a particular way, right? In academic reads, and folks have access and they're telling stories. I'm not trying to delegitimize that, but it would be great to check in with other voices to try to hear, because there are probably more stories that weren't able to be covered, or varying, stories or outlier stories that I want to hear. And so I talked earlier in the last comment about Brian Stevenson's this concept of get proximate, is that's the real way for you to have any opinion about any place. Right. It's not what you read, right? Not what someone told you. Not on a spreadsheet or an outcome or a report or an assessment, that's just not the right way to get to know a place. You got to get proximate.
Yeah, I agree. One of the things that I will say makes Hopkins unique in some ways to some of the other institutions where you may have worked is that, so I'm an alum. I'm the incoming president of the Alumni Association, but I actually didn't go to school in Baltimore. You know, I went to school in DC, and there's a campus in China, and there's a campus in Italy. And, you know, I now work for an international company. And when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's a very different conversation than the New York office is having. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts as you work your way through Baltimore, as you work your way through some of the other campuses. I think you'll have a lot to draw on, and you'll learn quite a bit, I think, as well.
Yeah. In our conversation, just you sharing that reality with me, just knowing that that's someone's lived experience gives me that opportunity to you know, to think about this in a more broad way. And,
Yeah.
And the impact and influence on a person's experience by that context is so important, right? You talked to me when we talked, you talked a lot about that, and I've started to even think about your experience and what that means, and how, you know, the connections we made and the things we talked about, and the ways that they shape who we are, and to have more opportunities to do that, I think would be, and I'm excited about your new appointment. And
Don't get too excited.
I'm sure there are lots of people who are excited.
I think now we'll open it up to a couple of questions from the audience, and one such question has come in already from Cheryl Adams. She writes, you know, welcome to JHU and congratulations on your appointment. You know, I'm wondering what one unique challenge you've anticipated here. So, that is a first for you, and how you plan on tackling that.
Thank you so much for that question, Cheryl. If I may, that's an interesting one. I've been thinking about that. Well, COVID is definitely a challenge that I haven't tackled before. And I know
Neither have we.
I know. That's probably a cop-out answer. That's probably a cop-out answer. I mean, the thing is, you know, so I'll give two answers. One is not, I hope not a cop-out answer, but the one I'll give is the cop-out answer, in that I'm a pretty relational person for the most part, even though we talked a little bit about being introverts. But in my work, in the way that I express myself and the way that I try to understand my work, I'm very relational. I want to hear folks' narratives. I want to hear, you know, be in their space and understand their perspectives. And so being in COVID, being in this COVID-19 moment on Zoom and being onboarded at a new institution has been very interesting. Everyone's been lovely, great, been great interactions, lots of meetings, but also some light moments. But that's definitely one, right? That you really can't get in people's spaces. You know, there are not those opportunities for those drop by someone's office moment. You know, everything has to be scheduled and planned, right? And there's really not a lot of time for in between to do the sort of kind of catching up with people or checking back in with people that you normally would in informal ways. So that's one. And so not to give a cop-out answer on that question, is I think that the other one is the research rigor and the reputation of Hopkins stands out for me in significant ways in terms of the opportunities, right? That Hopkins is a place for innovation and creativity and discovery and opportunity, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm excited about that, and it's both, and it's not challenged in the traditional sense of it being negative, but it's challenged in the boundless, right, ways to connect with folks, you know, who are doing, you know, cutting edge is such a cliche word, but it's happening at Hopkins. And so to be in the midst of folks who are doing that, and, you know, to be sobered by some of the challenges we also face is unique for me.
Yeah, that's great. I'm wondering, you know, we were just talking a few minutes ago about community and the commitment you have to sort of learning about the community that you've joined. What are some of the first steps that you see within your own personal roadmap to connect with the overall Hopkins community and the unique communities that you see or that you'll discover as you learn.
Right. So it's always for me just trying to figure out the ecosystem. And I've had great folks who've given me the breakdowns of the folks who are on the path. So when you think about a roadmap, you think about the folks who are on the path, so the natural partners, folks who are positional leadership, organizational leadership are great folks. But I always want to ask them who is not on the path. Like, right, who is the person that the path was not constructed for me to engage in? I also want to engage with those folks.
Yeah.
Right. Because they're going to give me that. They're going to fill out that narrative for me. So it's about, and I've had numbers of meetings with folks who just broken down the ecosystem. If these are the people in nonprofit you want to talk to, these are the folks in who are doing entrepreneurial work. Here are the folks in government, right? So they've given me all of those. Who in the churches. I listed folks, so now I feel like I got to name all the folks, all of those external entities. So if I didn't name you, it's not because you're not on my radar.
No, we know you personally left them out, and that they should take that personally.
Exactly. But I just want to be clear about that. But so I've had a number of folks who have given me insight of who those people in individuals and groups are, and then like I said, to kind of ask that question, who's not on the path because the path was not constructed for them to be on the path, and to figure out how to talk to them, right? How to have those conversations. And I was in Oxford. It was a lot of me just going to meetings in which I wasn't necessarily invited, but they didn't care that I showed up, right? Like, just going to the public library when folks were having conversations about things, and sometimes just being a member of the community. You're going to hear about things that they won't tell you as the chief diversity officer at Hopkins, right? So being a good community member, leaning into my service as a parent. I brought a 13-year-old here with me. And so he's starting school next week. And so, even just leaning into what does it look like to parent and be a responsible parent in this space, and in community engaged, being community engaged in community organizations of which I care about. So that's the kind of thing. And I have lots of friends and others who are here, and some of them who are alumni members as well, who are willing to share with me insights and experiences. So.
Oh, that's great. And, God bless you moving a teenager at any time, but in the middle of a pandemic. So good luck on that front. We have two more questions that have come in from audience members, and one is coming in from a gentleman named Joe Yoon, who says, "Welcome, Dr. Caldwell. In the roadmap to diversity, along with what's going on in the national stage, he's wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts about how non-underrepresented minorities should participate and factor into these discussions about D&I."
Oh, absolutely. So I think the term that comes to mind that is sometimes overused, but I think it's important in this case, and thank you for that question, is that term ally. I use it here because I think it's appropriate to think about, most folks in this space will say ally is a verb. So if you have, I talked about this before, but I'll accentuate it here. If you have power, you're in the best position to share it, right? And so when you're in a position of power, you're recognized as a person in a structured system who's empowered to do so. People need you to be an ally in the space. And they need you to be active, and they need you to do allyship, which means to lean in when it's appropriate for you to lean in, create space and opportunity for folks. Listen intently, make yourself small in the offering of our expertise, right, in our experiences, but large in our response to how we address the issues, right? So try to figure out that balance, that when we are in those spaces, we don't have to take up a lot of space. But when we're in places where we have power to change a system or a structure, then we want to be large in that space. We want to show up. We want to model for others what allyship looks like, right?
Yeah.
We want to engage, we want to ask questions. We want to, like I talked a little bit about before, we want to be honest about that we don't know anything, right? Or as someone said, we know nothing, right? When you go into those, into this work. And so be willing to do that. And when you make mistakes, be willing to own those and get right back in there and keep trying and keep doing this work. You know, much of the systems, and we already know this, and so I don't have to go into this, that we're currently operating in have been built for a long time. And part of the strength, there's lots of reasons why those systems are strong, right? They're invisible. They replicate themselves, and they socialize us in moving forward. The reward and punishment system that we're all invested in, they institute, they keep power in power. So all those, right, all those things.
Yeah.
But I think the biggest piece that we have that is problematic is that this hierarchy of oppression, that this oppression here today, that oppression here tomorrow, this oppression here, I'm only gonna focus on this oppression. I talked to a friend of mine who said to me, and so I won't name him because he'll be upset if I do. He said to me, I just realized that what I care deeply about is trafficking and its connection to racism. And for him, a person who's, no one would question his commitment to justice, right? He's been steeped in this work for a long period of time. No one would question his commitment. But the fact that he could be vulnerable and acknowledge the fact this is not something that I had made a connection, this is not something that I instinctively knew, that's the only thing that's one of the few things that are gonna help us dismantle systems.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I think, you know, there's a role for everyone to play. I'll say I started my career working within civil rights movement in Washington, D.C. 20 years ago. And, you know, the coalition that I worked for was a coalition of every single group, from labor to the NAACP to Latino organizations, Asian organizations. And the way in which all of these and gay and lesbian organizations, all of them, everybody came together to lobby on bills that we could agree on. And I think, you know, we given the current moment, we focused a lot on, you know, the United States has focused a lot on, you know, on African American issues of racial justice centered around the African American experience. But, you know, I live in New York City, and during COVID, you know, the hate crimes were occurring, and African Americans were not the main target. They were, you know, there was a lot of anti-Asian hate. And within the Hopkins community, that may not be an underrepresented minority, right? But I think that there's work for all of us to do that that resolves much of these conflicts. And when I say all of us, I mean the folks in the majority, folks in power, but also other folks who are not in power that maybe aren't thinking about how we all experience racism and injustice. You know, obviously some more than others, but or in some in different ways. But that's been on my mind quite a bit, because we all have to come together, and it requires empathy on all different parts.
Yeah, agreed. I agree.
There's another question that's come in. I think with the prominent, it's from an anonymous attendee, with the prominent role that Hopkins plays in the city of Baltimore, how do you envision Hopkins being a leader in the ongoing conversations around systemic racism?
That's a great question. Thank you for that question. And I think it aligns with a few of the things that we've said already. But I will say I appreciate that term leader. And I think we have to problematize what that means, right? So, you know, I struggle with this sometimes when I have conversations with folks, that I'll tell you, I hope this gets to the answer to your question, but I had a conversation with my son, who's now, I'm gonna give a plug out for him, 24 years old, living in New York at NYU. So we talked about his proximity to you and all of that. But anyway, and he's a Cornell undergrad. And so one day he and I were having a conversation about his activist work and advocacy work at Cornell. And I said the thing that folks in my position say by rote all the time: students have more power than we do. Mm-hmm. And it was a moment my son said, no, we don't. He said, we have a different kind of power, but we don't have more. And every day I put my body on the line in service of justice. Mm-hmm. And I need you as my mom to understand, not as a chief diversity officer in Mississippi, but my mom to understand that there's harm, there's pain, there's damage, and I need you and his administration to do more. Administrator to do more. Now, you know, I'm his mama, so.
How'd you take that?
Right. So my initial inclination, you know, is to be his mama, you know, but I heard him, right, and I had to think differently, right, in that moment of what I was asking him to do and what many of us were expecting by us saying that our students have power, what that meant, and then what our responsibility was. So I say all that to say, to get back to the question, this idea of what does a leader mean, particularly when you're in positional leadership and you have lots of power and lots of resources. And sometimes it means you're out in front. Sometimes it means you're picking up, carrying folks along until they have the ability to do it themselves, because you're going to give them the tools and the opportunity and the access and remove the barriers so they can do it on their own. And sometimes it's you getting in the back, being real quiet, right? Listening real attentively and leaving and saying nothing, right? Sometimes leadership requires you to do different things, right? Depending on what the moment calls for. And so I say that just in general, and not just about Hopkins, but it's what I believe about institutions, and it's what I believe about power.
Yeah, what it requires.
I hope that answered the question.
I thought it did, but I wasn't the anonymous attendee.
Right.
So I have another question from Kanika Rainey. So this could be a plant then. No. She asks, in the DEI space, quote unquote, risk averse organizations tend to focus on reactive interventions that are like, you know, band-aids versus more long-term strategic solutions. How will you challenge that sort of status quo and lean into peeling back the layers? And by layers, she means systems, processes, legacy, privilege that will create meaningful, sustainable long-term change.
So I have a term, a colleague of mine, I think he coined it, or it may have been around. This idea but I've been using it a lot lately, so I probably should give him a proper recognition, but radical transparency, right? This idea that, you know, systems, they flourish because we don't know their system. We don't identify the system when the system shows up. We don't identify the system historically. We don't identify the system in the current moment. We don't identify the system in our individual interactions. We don't identify the system, and so that's why the system, because we start to attack the person, right? We start to attack that group. We start to attack that particular moment. We don't think about it as a system. And so we have to make that system as visible to folks as possible. You know, we have lots of conversations about, you know, correcting individual behavior and training up folks so they know how to engage in an interpersonal way. And I think that's extremely important. Mm-hmm. Because we can sort of map the footprint of a person's engagement, right? We can look at their evaluations. We can look at their interaction with their colleagues. We can look at their performance. We can look at their service. We can look at their teaching, right? There are ways that we can understand how individuals exist and how their interpersonal interactions shape a particular context. we can't always see that in systems,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so we have to make that visible in systems, how this attaches. We just had a conversation with we just had a training right before this with my colleague, Erin Fox, who I think is on the call. Want to give shout out to Erin.
Hi, Erin.
Hi, Erin. Is that, that they, we were having a training around, a system that's particularly important in higher education tenure and promotion. And that, is sacred in the professoriate, and I value it and I understand it. And for a long time, researchers have been talking about different elements of that process where bias was built in, like CVs and evaluations and service. And when we think about those in very unique and discrete ways, we acknowledge the bias that's sometimes built in.
Yeah.
But then we say tenure is objective and tenure is, right,
Yeah.
all those things. But the things that build it up, the system that, the systems that support it.
Yeah.
Right. We need to make those visible. So I hope that answers the question for Kanika Rainey around how to do that. Yeah. Radical transparency.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. I think, we can, it's almost like behavioral economics. We can talk about individual behaviors and why folks may be prone to follow this path, but if that's the path of least resistance, then what, by virtue of what the system has built for them, then, our expectations are for individuals to go above and beyond in order to behave better. And that's a tough sell.
Yes,
We're sort of nearing the end of our discussion, which I'm super bummed about, actually. Right. So I look forward to continuing this discussion, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we as alumni, whether you could answer it for folks that are in underrepresented groups and also for those that aren't, because the alumni base is incredibly diverse. How can we be helpful?
Yeah, we actually had a long conversation of that. This was the majority of our conversation talking about that, and so one is just like I have I'm very make myself available to having conversations with folks because I like to hear narratives. I like to hear folks' stories in terms of their experiences, and I'm also always interested to be invited in folks' spaces. Whether it's groups of individuals or networks of individuals, to learn more about folks' experiences to inform, our strategies moving forward. So that's helpful for me to be invited in folks' spaces. I'm happy to do that. I want to be asked to do that. I also want to respect, the leadership, and so working with you and others to try to figure out ways we might be able to do that in partnership. But also, just to have individuals reach out to me that have questions or concerns. I know we're trying to figure out ways for us to invite sort of directed input as a part of the roadmap conversation. Like, how do we have an open door? We plan to have a work group structure. So our hope is that folks will participate in that structure. So we want to have structural ways for folks to engage in this work as well. But I also want to just hear compelling stories or compelling opinions or thoughts about where we might head. The way for there to be the largest impact is for us to think about how to do that in even though I try to incorporate every individual story I receive, right? Try to think about how does that change my thinking about this particular strategy, or how does that change my thinking about this particular step that we plan moving forward in those individual interactions. I think there's something about that collective. So I've done many things. I've gone to folks' homes where they've hosted events for me before COVID. I would say, or met folks for coffee. You're right. Like there's some alums that are northern in DePaul and other places where I still have great deep relationships with. They've invited me to serve on, boards when I can, or, be involved in their organization when I can, so those types of things. And just, I'm willing to be open to developing those relationships and interactions with folks.
Yeah.
So I hope that answers the question.
I am, and I think the Alumni Association and everyone is at the institution is super excited that you've come to join us. I think about this a lot as I'm about to take the helm of the Alumni Association. There are all kinds of student journeys that lead to the alumni journey, right? And and you spend 2 years, 4 years if you get a PhD at Hopkins, longer at the institution, but your relationship as an alum is the rest of your life. It's the longest relationship that you have with an institution. And, I think my job and Susan DeMuth's job is to make that relationship as wonderful and fruitful and healthy as possible. And provide people with space to engage and to fulfill their interests. But I think we're dependent on the kind of relationship that the person had as a student. And so we're really, if someone has a less than stellar experience, our hands are tied in changing their mind about the institution. And so I think I'm really excited that you are going to be at Hopkins, and you're going to be helping us really bridge that gap so that students have and have an amazing experience, and then it moves through on to continuing their relationship with the institution as an alum. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.
So at this point, I think we're going to turn it over to Elena, who has some final remarks for us.
Yes, I'll keep it nice and simple. I too would like to echo Anika's excitement in your being a part of our community, Dr. Caldwell. I think we are really lucky to have you as part of the institution, and this conversation just reinforces that feeling. I hope that others who joined us today really got a sense of who you are, at least a little bit, and now are, I think, called to some action if they are interested to engage in ways for a place in a community that I think is really meaningful and important to individuals, that there is space for people to engage. So I want to thank both of you for taking the time to have this conversation, to being open to the idea, and to having what I think is a really open and honest conversation, which really makes a difference. You two are going to be fabulous partners.
Yes.
Definitely, for sure.
I'm excited.
I also want to thank all of our participants today for taking time. I know that in this new normal for people, life is incredibly busy and jam-packed, and people are on technology for huge portions of the day. So to join us again, I do want to thank you. And I want to let everyone know that we will follow up this webinar with a survey. So we really welcome your feedback, and not just about this particular session, but if you are interested in having us talk about other topics, there's other subject matter that you would like us to explore, and if you have suggestions, or if you also would like to get engaged in this work, we would really appreciate hearing from you. It takes a village, so we would love to hear from you, whatever it is that you have to share. So with that, I think, look at that, and we're even maybe a few minutes early. Again, thank you everyone so much. I am in a second going to close us out. I hope that everybody has a fantastic evening, and we hope to see you soon if we can, but to hear from you sooner, since that might not be possible. Thank you again so much, everybody. Take care, be safe.